on internet. All right, we should be live. Hi, everyone. Sorry we're a little bit late today. We got a little bit of a late start. Welcome. Today we are talking about English language learners and IEPs and the discrimination process and how parents are often left out of a lot of important decision making and a lot of the process when it comes to their kids and education in general, but particularly IEPs. I just want to go over a few quick things first. First, just know that IDEA and procedural safeguards and all the federal guidance around this is very clear about this, that your IEP, your copy of your procedural safeguards, all that stuff, it needs to be in a language that you can understand. And the same goes for the IEP meetings. So it's just not a negotiable item. It's not that the district can say, we don't have to do that, or that's not appropriate, or, whatever other excuse. It's just not up for debate. The Office of Civil Rights and all the case law supporting it has been very clear in that it needs to be in a language which allows the parent for meaningful participation. I also just want to throw in there that since that includes IEP meetings and we're talking about translators, the translator needs to be a translator and they need to be someone familiar with the education process. That means that they don't grab a language teacher from the high school to sit in on your IEP meeting. They don't grab any other staff that they have around the building who may or may not speak your language. A lot of times the assumption is that they speak your language, but it's not about grabbing, a random person in the building who speaks the same language as you. It needs to be a translator. And just as an advocate for the educators and so on who are watching today, the ways that I've seen language and not speaking English as your primary language used against parents and children. One of the main things I see as an advocate is children who come from non-English speaking families and their learning disabilities go unidentified and unaddressed, and they just get tossed into English as a second language classes, and that's it. And they may have a reading disability, and that's the reason why they can't read. It's not that they don't speak English, it's that they have dyslexia. So those are just some of the ways that I really see it being used and abused, against parents. And of course, the assumptions around, I live in an area that has a large Latino population. And the assumption is that if you speak Spanish, the assumption is that you're undocumented, regardless of how long you've been here, your status, or any of that. And in fact, should go without saying that most immigrants here are legal immigrants. We shouldn't have to remind people of that, but I find that we usually do. And I've seen a lot of parents bullied because of that. I've seen them left out of conversations. Even if a sidebar conversation takes place at an IEP meeting and the parent isn't included in it and the parent can't understand that, that's the type of thing that should not be happening. So I think that's it. I think that's all I have to intro with. And some others might be popping in. Today was just kind of a weird day, and some folks just got their electricity on recently. Hopefully you're not one of those, but I'm going to pass it to Jess today first.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica. I am the mother of 2 young boys. My eldest, who is 10, is diagnosed with autism as well as ADHD, anxiety, and receives support from the school district. He is currently at an online charter school, a choice that we made after both race and ability for him, and it was a good choice. We also have a 4-year-old who is currently working through the early intervention system, or what's called Project Connect here in Pennsylvania. He's demonstrating what looks like to be autism-like symptoms and receiving a certain amount of support online now that things have been changed due to COVID. And I myself am a first-generation American. I am originally from New Jersey, residing in Pennsylvania, and learned very young about what it meant to be both a person of color as well as experience the world supporting a non-English speaker as a parent, and being a young kid still needing to be the support and translator, as well as had to be very mindful about my own degree of eloquency, simply so that I would have leveraged my power as much as you can as a 10-year-old um, through language. And I say that because people who aren't speaking what we would typically see as everyday English is not something that is uniform within our own country, and it's taught outside of the country to within the other nations learning English. And so I say this simply because my mom actually did learn English when she was living outside of the US, but she was taught a British English, and she also still had what would be a very heavy accent. My sister, who is only a few years older than me, has auditory processing disorder, and very early on needed a lot of support. So in the 90s, my mom, who would go to IEP meetings, would need me often to support her, not only being eloquent with my responses so that it's at least gave her a degree of credibility that I don't think they gave to people simply for not sounding English, but also because it was just the phrasing and the outcomes that were to be expected from the things that were said by the staff that my mom couldn't understand, and therefore couldn't anticipate what the results of some of her own decisions, which were made in many times in ignorance because no one was supporting her education at that moment, would mean. Some of the things that happened, which I know happens to a lot because it almost happened to my own family years down the line, but my sister at about second grade was requested to be part of an ESL class, and my sister only spoke English. There was a heavy belief that my mom, who only spoke English to me and my sister, simply because they could hear her accent, simply because they knew she spoke another language, must therefore have imparted some sort of weakness onto my sister, and therefore that's why she couldn't read or write as well as the other students. And it couldn't have been something more complex or neurological. And at that point, I remember as a kid explaining some of the things they were saying to my mother, simply because they had no interest to meet my mother where her language's deficits were. And it almost, for my mom, it didn't seem like it made much sense, but it was with the forcefulness that she had to approach the situation to get them to take my sister's problems more seriously that we walked into an endless awareness that we would be fighting not just my sister needing support, but that we would always look different and therefore have prejudices about what we were capable of alongside of that at all times. And I'm mentioning this because this is an added layer, but our experiences are unique to being and my sister as well, being a child of an immigrant. But we were lucky in the sense that we are not Black appearing or if anything, sometimes racially ambiguous. And it's really vital that people at times would give us leverage or power simply because we didn't have those added difficulties. I knew of families who have been treated worse off. And so there are multiple layers of complexity and difficulty. And so our race had some degree of difficulty for us. And but my language ability was often something that helped support us. But if there is a difficulty with not speaking English at all and being of a different race, such as being Black, that is an infinitely harder situation. And it does not remove the realities that having an IEP is a difficult situation for families. But to add on to it, not being able to speak is another layer. And in addition, being Black is even much harder. And I don't want to necessarily create levels of intensity, but I want to acknowledge that my experiences were not layered by an additional difficulty of being Black in America, because being Black in America is hard. Being Black in the globe is hard. But I wanted to mention that my experiences will come from this place of knowing that there's ethnicity, nationality, and language barriers, but there's going to be people talking and potentially talking about how it's also influenced by race, which I can't necessarily speak deeply about. But once they do, that is an added layer of difficulty that needs to be acknowledged and be treated fairly about, and not disregarded or kind of brushed away as something that's smaller than it is, because it's a deeper problem. And so in my own family, like I said before, there was my sister who was treated like the only issue she would experience or could experience must have been this language issue. And in my own son's case, that here in Pennsylvania, we were given this conversation about, are you sure that his language couldn't be because you were speaking another language to him? And I explained time and again that when you write those long documents to doctors and teachers that say only English, that I mean only English, that I'm not sneaking in language there that would otherwise, confuse him, that I understood that. But we also come from an area where the environment of English is the same as the English that I'm speaking. And potentially, if like I was originally raised in Newark, the English that I was learning from my environment was a little bit different than the English that my son is experiencing, because we live in a very unstratified, very white neighborhood, and the English is very, I would say, colonial, very typical. So I wanted to mention that there are going to be layers being discussed, and to be very open-minded about what it is that we're seeing, because maybe you don't see it, but we all have experienced it, and definitely want to allow people to have a voice. I believe that Monique would definitely like to share a little bit of experience as well. So I'm going to toss it to Ms. Monique.
Thank you, Jess. And for those of you that are out there listening, we really thought that it was very important that Jess kicked this off, because we knew that would be very easy, or a little bit more acceptable and embracing for you to listen to, as she unfolded into the other layers that occur when you're Black. I really liked the way she said leveraging our power, and actually leveraging our power through articulation. Because before we even get to what this topic is about the disability as English as a second language, it's very important that we talk about how parents are definitely or can be left out of that conversation or out of that circle before we even get to the disability part, just by being Black. And perhaps where English may not be your first language. Or as Jess talked about, English may be your first language, but you may be from an island or somewhere where the King's English is spoken very differently than it's spoken here in America, and can be misconstrued. Presumptions are made just through the communication. So, as we continue to unpack these layers of being Black first, before language, of how you are treated during the conversations with your child study teams or your teachers in school. We really would like for you to listen and to leave this conversation thinking about all of those things first. Who is that parent? And one of the things, that Jess also said about the different manners or the different ways in which we all may speak. But if you get to know who those parents are, who they are as individuals, who they are culturally, what their interests are, who their children are, who they are, some of these biases that occur don't have to necessarily happen. Everyone doesn't think it's great for you to say to them, "You're so articulate." "Oh, you're just so articulate." We all can communicate and get across what needs to be happening or what should occur for all of our children, regardless of whatever manner we communicate. So I think that's a really important place to start, is who is that parent and how are they communicating across the table? And then we move into, and who is this child or this young adult or this adult? And what type of supports do they need in order to support the way that they communicate, whether it's English as your first language or English as your second language? And I'm going to pass this on to Cheryl Lynn.
And actually, Monique, it's
Yes, I'm passing it on to Safir.
yes, I'm going to jump in. Thank you so much for sharing that. And these are very important facts and details that we are sharing today, because as you've already clearly articulated, and quite well, I might add, the very first thing that you'll perceive about a person is their color. And there could be a number of assumptions that are associated with colorism and anti-Blackness. But then it's further exasperated when language barriers play a role in prohibiting access to education for students. The Migration Policy Institute recently in 2015 and 16 commissioned a study to examine discrimination on the basis of language barriers for English language learners. And what they found was quite interesting. There's 4 personal discrimination types that they've identified that are primary, and then there's 4 structural discrimination types that occurred during this study. From a personal discrimination standpoint, they found that in general, school districts would devalue the primary language of English language learners and their families, and they would also maintain a negative view of bilingualism. They also found, and this is in line with other studies that we'll bring up later in the broadcast, that schools and school districts would assign lower educational expectations for students of color who were also English language learners. And of course, that led to a decline in their academic and social outcomes. They couldn't acquire or develop effective social skills for that reason, because when you have a lower expectation for a student, you certainly do not try as hard as you would for someone who you believe could achieve an unlimited possibility. And then you have another finding where there was an inherent negative interaction with school staff and peers for families of students who were English language learners. And of course, much like Jess's story, that included negative comments or sidebar conversations during IEP meetings, negative comments and assumptions based on a child's accent, and of course, outright impatience by staff and educators with those students who would struggle to express themselves in English. And so there's this association with the ability to speak English and one's assumption about a child's level of intelligence, when in reality, those two things are not directly linked. And when you start talking about the structural discrimination that took place, the study found that schools oftentimes would segregate these students, leaving them out of classrooms where they could acquire more advanced education. They would concentrate these students in schools and in classrooms that had low exposure to English fluent students. They also lacked high quality educational resources, oftentimes being taught by less experienced and less skilled teachers. And in some cases, it even led to misdiagnosis of special education needs with teachers because they would conflate the issue of limited English proficiency with learning disabilities. And naturally, of course, this almost always leads to lower engagement with parents because teachers are often unable to either communicate with parents and engage with them because of these barriers. So parent engagement is already an issue in communities of color, where the school districts don't necessarily value the voice of parents because of an assumption either of limited education and the ability to articulate an intelligence, or simply because they have an inherent belief that your ability to understand is much lower than that of your peers who are not of color. And so these challenges obviously make it more difficult for students to acquire education. It leads to a much larger dropout rate, and it certainly reduces the amount of advancement that those students might otherwise experience in school. And so these are facts, these are experiences that we are sharing, but they are also accompanied by statistics and data and details that are examined and studied across the country. Recently, the Department of Education in Florida was sued by the Southern Poverty Law Center because they charged that the school district or some of the school districts were illegally barring immigrant children who had limited English skills from even enrolling in high school. What they found was that they were instead enrolling these students in adult English language learning classrooms that did not give them credit toward their degree or their diploma. And therefore, they were simply putting them in a space to consume time and to check off a box while knowingly preventing those students from even graduating. So when we talk about the level of discrimination that exists for Black students and how it's further exacerbated when those students are English language learners, these are the types of constructs that are in place that prohibit and prevent success and positive outcomes for these students. So I'm grateful that we're having this conversation, but this is just the beginning. This is where it starts. We have to make a concerted effort to address these systemic issues that limit our children's education and their outcomes because of a belief that they can't achieve. So at this time, I want to turn to Cheryl Lynn.
Hi, sorry about the delay there. Okay, it's interesting that you mentioned that because just last month, July 24th, in Massachusetts, the public school district had to settle a discrimination lawsuit because the parents weren't given information at all. IEPs, incident reports, anything, the parent handbook. This was in Springfield, Massachusetts. So it's not uncommon, and especially in Massachusetts, who's like very big on human rights and mental health. They're very big on that. But there's places where it falls through the cracks and parents don't know. Town that I live in, we have Hispanics, but we have a big population of Haitians. And a lot of them don't speak English. You know, they came over during the earthquake. So they don't know how to ask what they need for their child. And the child is caught in the middle from what the school wants them to do. And the parents say they can't turn to because the parent doesn't know what to do or how to get them the help. I know in the Hispanic community, which is my community, I've seen a lot of parents, they're like totally do not know what their rights are, IEPs, none of that, because they don't speak English. If they even can read, a lot of them can't even read. So it's okay, the school, which I know, my district, they like to put X on signatures. I'm totally against that.
Wow.
You know, I am Puerto Rican. I'm from New York. So my parents came from Puerto Rico, but they came speaking English and Spanish. But I remember even at school, if I had to bring a note from home to the teachers wouldn't read the note and say, who wrote this? And I'm like, my mom. And they didn't believe me
Wow.
because she knew how to write in English. She had a college degree. So it was like, no, that's impossible. I'm like, yeah, no, my mom wrote that. Doesn't she have a pretty penmanship? You know? But it's that perception that if you're this way, if you're Spanish, you don't know English. If you're any other minority, you don't fit into that box they want to put you in. In my district, we have a lot of Haitians and Polish. So when the kids come here that don't speak English, they don't go to we have like 8 elementary schools. No, they go to the special ed building because that's where they need to first learn the English before they can go into their neighborhood school district. When I went to school, we didn't have bilingual classes. We just have regular classes. When bilingual classes started coming up, I remember it was an issue because the kids, if they showed them a coat and they were from a warm climate, they wanted to tell them, okay, what is that? I think a kid from Puerto Rico back then knew what a coat was. If you don't wear a coat, you're not gonna know it's a coat. If they show them a banana, the kid's gonna call it a plátano because that's what it is. They will be marked wrong. And it's a shame that even now, 30, 40 years later, we still have this issue. I mean, we still have an issue that if you're Puerto Rican, they ask for ID. They forget Puerto Rico is part of America. We don't need a passport. But this is what happens. And a lot of parents, and I've heard teachers say, well, like the parents don't know how to, they don't know the language, so they can't help their kids with their homework. I've heard a teacher say, well, how come that's not the case with the Asian families? They don't speak the language and their kids are straight A's. You know, and I don't know, it's just this thing where parents, and also Spanish parents, I know where I came from, my parents, education is number one. It's a very big thing, education, because that's really the only way to get ahead. And a lot of Spanish people feel the teacher's always right. And even if the kid says, no, mom, but no, that's the teacher, she knows better. So they'll go for the adult instead of helping the child. Because sometimes it's not the right thing, you know. The kid is saying, he's telling you something. And parents need to open their eyes a little bit more and listen to their kids, but also watch how things are going on in the school. I mean, my kids they're Spanish because I adopted them, but they're not Spanish. They're Caucasian and Black, but their last name is Medina. So what happened? They couldn't take a Spanish class in the high school because they assume you already know Spanish. And they don't. They know words here and there, but they have nothing Spanish in them. That's not their bloodline. But because they have a Spanish last name, they can't take Spanish in high school.
And again, it just goes back to not just looking at names, not
Yep.
seeing who someone is by how they may sound over the telephone. It is really about getting to know your families that you are serving, for those of you that are listening, as well as who those children are. And what families look like today in real
Right.
life. Families look very different than what they may have looked like, and even recognizing, the families that you are dealing with, and this has really come up during this COVID-19 time as well. A lot of Black and brown families are those essential workers. A lot of Black and brown families are not attending your meeting, not because they don't care, because they may be sleeping because of the type of job they are working, or they may.
Yes.
So it is really important to know who are your families and how are the best ways to connect to them. Because Carolyn said it the very best way possible, is that all families love their children and all families care about education.
Absolutely. And when you think about the experience that Charlene just shared about how her children were not allowed to take Spanish courses in high school because of the assumption that their last name meant they were Hispanic or Latino themselves. And one could assume that it's because it would be perceived that they would have an unfair advantage because they already spoke the language. But how is that even considered unfair when in reality, the King's English or the English that is so widely spread and taught in America is inherently giving an unfair advantage to students who are white. And so when you think about how this discrimination, it infiltrates the education system, you also have to realize that there's this longstanding issue of segregation that still rears its ugly head today. There was a comment that was left on the broadcast by one of our viewers, and they mentioned that they had been questioned often about their national origin during ARD due to their appearance. She states that she's an American citizen, a descendant of survivors of Middle Passage. And she's certain those questions were about deciding if they could weaponize her immigration status, which is common where she says in Texas, usually leveraged at Spanish speakers there. Her daughter even had to test to prove that she did not know Spanish because they thought that that could be causing the learning issue, even though parents had already told the schools that she did not know Spanish and that English was her primary language. Even more recently, there's a lawsuit currently in New Jersey. And in January, a judge ruled that they could move forward. The complaint shows, with the data that they used across the state, that more than 100,000 Black and Latino students attend schools that are at least 99% non-white. And this goes back to the point that we made in a few broadcasts prior, that New Jersey, among other states, are still some of the most segregated areas in this country. And so that segregation makes it easy to give lower quality education to students who are non-white, makes it easy to give misclassifications and misdiagnosis, or to relegate students to learning environments that are not conducive to positive student outcomes.
Cheryl Lynn, is there anything else that you'd like to share at this time as we move forward, or Jess?
I know New Jersey is very segregated, and that has been proven over and over again. And everything, I know they used to do busing when the kids were in elementary school in Jersey City, where they would bus kids from another district into another district. Like they would take this, I lived in Jersey City Heights. The majority of the kids in the school, there was a big Indian population and Hispanic. So they would bus the Hispanic kids to the west side of Jersey City, where most of the school is African-American kids. So it didn't matter where you bought your house because your kid was gonna be shipped to another district no matter what. And this constantly would happen, and it still happens. It still happens. I see it in my own district. And, you know, we have 2 middle schools. I would say one is predominantly Black. The other one was predominantly white. So they started doing was taking the kids that live across the tracks, which is usually never the good area, and bring them to the middle school where it's mostly white kids. So it happens a lot in Jersey. Within communities, it's very segregated by color, by nationality, and by disability. These out-of-district placements, yeah, they're good, but that's also a form of segregation. Keeping them out of the eye, moving them away. We don't have to see them. We don't have to deal with them. And that's not how it should be. A kid will learn more with other students in general population. I understand some kids do need it, but when they moving kids are out because of a behavior issue, the school doesn't want to handle it. So let's put them in a different schooling. That's the problem. And when you're doing it to Black and brown kids, that's a huge, huge problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, it reminds me of what I used to see take place when I was in elementary school. And it gives you, if it gives you any sense of how long ago that was, I graduated high school in 1998. Not that that's that long, but it's long enough. So when I was in elementary school, I distinctly remember that all of the students who were English language learners were relegated to the basement in my school. In fact, for the first 3 years that I was there, you know, from kindergarten through 3rd grade, I didn't even know they were down there. We never interacted. We didn't have lunch together. We didn't have gym together. It wasn't until I left that school to enter into 6th grade that I met many of those students. And so when you think about that type of action, what you come to realize is that it's really, it is discrimination, it is segregation, but more importantly, it's harmful to those students because never did they have the opportunity to sit side by side with peers who were fluent in English, with peers who could also learn from them. You know, it's an opportunity where we can learn from each other and we can build upon cultural sensitivities and identify with those differences, not shying away from them, but actually embracing them, because those things that make us unique are the things that make us better and together make us stronger. So those are the types of opportunities that they rob our children of because of the idea that someone who is not a resemblance of what I value is going to hold back my child. And it's really shameful.
Yes.
At this time, I'm going to turn really quickly to Jess, who has something to share with regards to colonialism.
I'm not sure if Jess is.
Yeah, I want to just address what we're really talking about when we say, okay, I'm sorry. My internet has been a little wonky the last few days with the storms and things. So just in case if I take a few seconds, I apologize. So the story, I guess I wanted to discuss if possible is awareness that there is to assume that a is not going to understand the information given, and that knowing or maybe inherent prejudice that that person could never understand or could never know. And what we see a lot, especially in the US, is that there is a very great, a certain form is better or demonstrative of greater intellect. What we're really talking about is colonized language. We're talking about English that is prevalent globally, being or needing to be seen in a certain way for it to be credible. And conversations like, and we can even go so far as to discuss that in TV shows like I Love Lucy, where Ricky Ricardo was always teased about his English. And it's funny because Ricky Ricardo could speak 2 languages and it's demonstrative of his intellectual ability, but we still lean on the belief that a poor or a imperfect form of English from a bilingual speaker still beneath a perfect form of English. Talk about colonization specifically because our English is different region to region for many reasons. And one of them is influences of other countries having at some point been very heavily present. But we also have to give credence that African-American English vernacular, or vernacular English, I apologize, is its own language and a credible one, with grammar and often actually co-opted by mainstream communities. Our job as people who are advocating for children with special needs is to see that differently learning people with different abilities are not beneath us, but are needing accommodations. And so if your job is to meet people where they're at, and you're from, and I, as a child, was raised in Newark, New Jersey, learned a very different form of English than I learned in the suburbs. It was no less important and no less informative. And especially as of immigrants, our language was very much immersed from or derivative of the environment. So we had words that were based off of the culture of having a number of different languages involved. We had, like I said, the African-American vernacular. I learned a lot, and I learned language, but that also imparted on me bits of the culture, as much as many of my African-American family members and friends learned Spanish words and were able to add on to their conversations through that. And so the lens was widened. But once we walk into places that become so focused on the American English that is the very colonized, gate kept. And let's be honest, it's very gate kept. It's a way of speaking that we expect academia to speak, but that means losing a lot of your language if your language is from the inner cities within a certain community. And that language is no less informative or intellectual. It's just differently, what I was going to say, sourced. And so I wanted to mention that, because if you're sitting in an IEP meeting and you're speaking in terms of a situation, you can break it down into smallity to become involved. Why not? What is it about you keeping the language so strict and keeping them so alienated out that is important for you? And that's what you really need to start asking yourself. Why is my language need to be so gatekept from these community members? Why? What are those inherent anti-Black sentiments I'm carrying? Because that's where it comes from. Couldn't be smart because they don't read or have learned the way that I've learned. But the truth is that we are here explaining to you tenements of social justice, not because we read them by a Karl Marx, but because we are experienced in them. And therefore, our knowledge is not necessarily need to come from books or books written by certain community members, but they truly are experiences, and they're just equally hard as that her language, because your language is that greatly in disparity of what this person is able to understand and what they can provide. You're really not getting a consent from an informed person anymore. If you are a person whose language is different culturally within the US and you still do speak English, I apologize, I have a cold. True component of superiority, if you can't understand that you are creating a sense of inferiority for people who aren't speaking like you, or in an academic sense. And when you realize what does an academic sense really mean, it means a long time gap by certain communities for certain purposes, and that's to retain power.
Absolutely. And just,
So I wanted to let you guys know.
yeah. And you raise a very good point, because all of these constructs lend themselves to upholding supremacy, superiority, and inflicting upon others inferiority because of a lack of appreciation for the differences in how they speak. And so that is definitely something that has to be dismantled and addressed. There is another question that we received on the broadcast in Facebook, and it comes from a first-year special education teacher. And they ask, do we have any suggestions for the best way to reach out to parents if they are not used to reviewing information about their students? Monique, I'm going to turn to you first to see if you can take that on, and then we'll go around the circle. Monique?
I'm sorry about that. I think first and foremost, it's very important to hear what just shared. That's a great avenue to start really understanding, anyone that you're dealing with in regards to what a two-way communication looks like. But also, as I mentioned earlier, really getting to know through informal conversations who your families are, and learning who that student is through those families. Safir shared in an earlier broadcast something that's called a positive student profile. And, parents use that a lot of times in order to share their own child's strengths, their own dreams and aspirations and expectations, which has been a lot of what this conversation is. So that can actually be a great tool for you to use in order to start that conversation in a very positive way to parents to learn about their children, and also to use those opportunities to find ways to communicate in a way that works successfully for everyone. Safir?
Thank you, Monique. I think another aspect that needs to be incorporated in that, and really it should be a requirement for teachers coming into either a new school district or just entering into the profession within the classroom. There really needs to be a vast and very intentional effort to achieve cultural sensitivity and cultural relevance, with how we teach, certainly with how we individualize plans, IEPs, and there has to be a better job rendered when it comes to preparing teachers to engage with students who are not from where they are from. And perhaps it requires that they spend a year or so shadowing another educator, spending time face-to-face with community organizations to really gain an understanding of what's taking place in that community so that they can better serve in their profession.
I guess, and most importantly, recognizing your own biases, right? You have to really go into this recognizing and understanding your own thoughts, your own presumptions, your own experiences, how you were brought up, and all of those things that you bring to the table when you are about to embark in a career that really shapes and molds our future generations. And it's a very, very important job, and one that I think, we really need to, as Safir said, look at how we approach this in a very different way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to turn to you, Sherilyn, to see if you have an answer to the question. What suggestions do we have for the best way for a new first-year special education teacher to reach out to parents if she's not used to reviewing information about their students?
Okay. I'm back. I would say get to know the parents. And I think that bridge at the PTO helps a lot, because a lot of the Spanish parents are involved in PTO, and that's a good way to learn about, I know like in workplaces, they try to get the group together, and sometimes it's, they do things regarding their own culture, whether it's a luncheon, everybody brings a different plate. It's sharing our differences to bring us together. And I think that speaking to the parents and learning about someone's culture, because what you might say, even in the medical field, we have to be aware of people's cultures. We can't just assume everyone is a blank slate. They're all the same. No, you can't just, you have to be respectful of their culture, of their religion, because all that comes into play. I would say look at the PTO for guidance, speak to the parents, and there's always something that you can connect with. There's always something. I mean, after all, we're all humans. So there is something we can all connect with. And also you learn different things. I love learning about different people, where they come from, how, like talking before, I speak Spanish, but sometimes I have clients that speak Portuguese. And believe it or not, I can understand every other word, but I can get an idea of what they're saying. If you put your mind to it, you can figure it out. I've seen this happen in a lot of different cultures, but if you take the time and truly listen, you can connect. And I think that's a plus for the kid. That is a plus for the kid.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point because while, as you mentioned, the PTO is a great resource for building those relationships with parents. What I find in districts that are near to where I live, there's not as much of an emphasis on the establishment and maintenance of a PTO as I believe there should be. Parent engagement is paramount to student success in education. And if we don't make a concerted effort to improve, establish even, and maintain vehicles to engage parents effectively, we are going to fail our students and will fail them miserably. So that is all that I have for right now. I would like to turn at this moment this portion of the broadcast over to Lisa Leitner of A Day in Our Shoes.
Sorry about that. I was still on the Facebook page taking one last look for questions and a couple of good suggestions. Let me just click back. Somebody suggested to, I know I lost it. Look into your district's language services as far as interpretation and translation and see what they offer and see if you can use them. And one I like from Greta, formal cultural exchange living and working outside your comfort zone. And I think that's pretty much sums it up as far as what we're asking folks to do, as far as, be uncomfortable, listen to things that you don't want to hear or that make you uncomfortable and see what you can learn from it. Just to recap what most of our panelists said, I've never met a parent who didn't want their kid educated. I mean, I have never, ever met a parent who said, I don't want my child to receive an education. So I think to make that assumption about any, race or color, which we know happens to Black students more, but it's just such a bad assumption to make because it's just not true. It's all parents want their kids educated. When it comes to the different languages, I know one area of pushback that I've heard a lot from white folks is, well, when my Irish ancestors came here, they learned English. And when my Italian ancestors came here, they were embarrassed to speak Italian and they made sure that they learned English. But I don't see that as a good thing. I don't see how that is a good thing because, my grandparents and great grandparents did the same thing. And now I sit here as a 50-year-old woman who knows not a single word of Polish. I know nothing about my Polish heritage. I try to make recipes for my kids and I can't even pronounce the recipes. So as Jess pointed out, that's something that was forced upon immigrants. But that doesn't mean that it's good. And just because some did it more willingly than others, I guess. And also let's call it what it is here. White people were still given more opportunities because you were more willing. Well, and at some points, slavery was still legal and people still kept slaves, but during this time, but you were more willing to take a white Irish person under your wing and teach them English than you were, say, a Black African or a Black Jamaican and take them under your wing and teach them English. That didn't happen. So to say like, oh, well, they were forced to learn English and they did it, it's not the whole picture. So anyway, I don't want to go off on a tangent because I feel like the thoughts in my head are clearer than the thoughts that are coming out of my mouth, and that's never a good thing. Again, just a reminder to be aware of this. I had a quick little Facebook chat with one of the commenters, and I said, I find that the retaliation against Black families most often is called CPS. And I find that the retaliation most often against brown families or non-English speakers is to call INS or to threaten to or to hint at it. And and try to get at a person's immigration status. I mentioned the principal who every IEP meeting I attended with him for a while, he would say that it was a key phrase, and I remembered what it was. It was, he'd say, "Oh, where did you park?" Which seems like a pretty innocuous phrase, but what he's getting at is your driving status so that he can determine if you have a driver's license or not. Because this was a principal who made some comments about my client, and when we did a FERPA request, we found many racial slurs in addition to the mental health slurs. So he absolutely was trying to, and it seems a really innocent way to, "Oh, where'd you park?" Which is kind of a dumb thing to say in a suburban school district that has a parking lot. Like, where do you think I parked? I parked in the parking lot. But you know, that was his way to kind of get at, if you said, "Oh, I had a friend drive me," or "Oh, I was dropped off," or something like that, they could maybe kind of, and it was also a posturing move. It was posturing in that I've kind of forced you to give me a bit of information about yourself if you are in fact not a legal citizen of this country. So, which doesn't matter. So anyway, you know, my advice is keep trying. To the teachers out there, keep trying. There are a lot of people, yes, sorry, backing up a bit. Intimidation occurs all the time based on presumed immigration status. And in fact, you know, this particular principal, the racial comments that were in his email that we got later were in reference to, you know, I live in a large, as I've said, I live in a large Latino community. It was that they all have a career or a future in gardening and landscaping. So that was his thought. That was his, you know, he put that in writing to teachers. So if you think that that type of LEA is going to be fair in an IEP meeting toward your child, you know, that's not happening. So there are a lot of families out there who are more than justified in being skeptical of school systems. They have every reason to be skeptical. So, you know, keep trying, because we can come together on this. I believe that. I wouldn't be using up everybody's time every Monday like this if I didn't think that we could influence some change in the world and move to a better place, because I think sorry, my microphone just fell. If we could get there. So I think we can. So anyway, that brings us to next week. Next week is adult services. So Sabra hopefully will be back then. We had a few illnesses and other little snafus today, but I forget who else is the moderator. Are you Monique? Because yeah, Monique and Sabra, I believe, are the moderators next week. And we're going to talk about accessing adult services, well, specifically adult disability services, transition planning, and things like that. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next Monday.